Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and I'm a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University, and we're continuing in a study of my book, The Natural Moral Law, The Good After Modernity, and we're in chapter 1 right now, which is about the postmodern challenge. And I'm going through these sections in the chapter, so this is the second video on the chapter, and we're looking at the patterns that I identify, patterns in thinking about the good. Patterns within modernity. And I take a little bit of time in this section to define how stages or eras or time periods of history work, how they are expressions of beliefs that we have about knowledge and what is real and what is good, and those are allowed to work themselves out in human history. And they, in the last video, I talked about idols, misunderstandings that prevent us from having knowledge and make us misrepresent God and the good. And so this happens in the modern age. I go over that in some detail, starting on page 33. As I'm going through these, I'm not going through each detail, but I'm kind of walking through the chapter, so it would help if you have the book, and it's meant to be a guide as you read it. And I won't go through every single detail, but we look at that and how generations work in terms of bringing to fruition beliefs about the world. And when those beliefs are incorrect, they lead to excessive behavior. And that's because we form beliefs in order to have meaning. And false beliefs, beliefs about the good that are not accurate, lead to meaninglessness, emptiness. And so then we'll try to fill our lives, that meaninglessness, and since we haven't been able to do it with the truth, we'll do it with something else, excessive behavior. There's only a few kinds of excessive behavior. In the previous video, the previous section, I talked about Baal and Ashtoreth as types of looking to power and pleasure as sources of meaning. And that requires excessive behavior because those don't actually provide meaning. You have to do more and more and more of them to try to still get meaning out of them. And there's a kind of limit to that excess, which brings about collapse. And so the changes that occur in an era or in a culture or a civilization occur first internally. We might study history in terms of wars. Look at war after war after war, and a change is brought about when an external army invades or starts a war. But first, there's an internal change that has occurred because you haven't found meaning. You've gone to excess, and that excess has brought about collapse. And so I look at that, and I go into more detail than that, what I'm saying right now, but that's what that section is about. And I consider the example of Confucius, who noted that during his time period in China, the Warring States period, and why was there this disunity going on? And he speaks especially about the rectification of names. If language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant. And if what is said is not what is meant, then what must be done remains undone. If this remains undone, morals and art will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. Hence, there must be no arbitrariness in what is said. This matters above everything. So words are used, but those words are emptied of meaning. So words like justice, good, happiness, love, everyone likes to use those words and say they're on the side of those things, but in fact they've been emptied of meaning. And they don't mean the same things. What is said is not what is meant, and it causes a deterioration in morals and art. Interesting, he picks out those two things, and there's some connection between those two things. You can maybe compare that and see how it is reinforced by what Plato talks about with art, why those go together, and how art encourages a excessive behavior when art itself is emptied of meaning, why it encourages excess. So to call something good, which is not an end in itself, is to empty that word of meaning. Or in the case of modernity, we can look at epistemology, what it said about reason or experience, trying to get knowledge that way, what it said about science, why it didn't get epistemology right, and how that led to inability to understand what is real, what is called naive realism or common sense realism, and inability to bring about the good life, focusing, for example, on pleasure, making yourself happy, everyone being able to have freedom to do what they think will make them happy, and why that collapsed. And then I'm going to look at the patterns. I'm going to do this in a separate video, but that's what the next section is about. I go over 7 patterns that occur, that if you can identify these things, you see the outcome. And it's worth looking at those in some detail, and they really explain the method in the book for the rest of the book. 7 patterns identified. I've taught about one of them so far. identifying epistemology and how it influences metaphysics and how it influences ethics. And you can make some predictions based on where someone starts off in epistemology, where they're going to end up about the good. So again, chapter 1 in the natural moral law, as we consider the challenge of postmodernity. And challenges aren't bad. This is not to say postmodernity is bad, not at all. Challenges may expose those idols that Bacon and Nietzsche talked about. And so they're necessary to expose those. The question isn't if the challenge is good or bad. The question is what we do with the challenge. Does it make us become more consistent, more conscious, more consistent, or less conscious, less consistent? So we'll continue next time through chapter 1, looking at those patterns. Thanks for joining me.